I'm glad to, well, I hope you all have received, this is the marketing moment, I hope you have received all the first institute brief and that you have that. The institute will be is working on a series of publications, and this is our first brief, that we are very glad to bring it today here to Rome, and hopefully all the associates of the institute will be also able to bring their expertise as today here, and make it also available for everybody through these regular briefs that the institute will be producing. And now I'm really happy to introduce Cecile Dubernet. She's a senior lecturer at the Catholic University of Paris. She specializes in international relations and is currently developing peace trainings at the Catholic Institute of Paris in cooperation with the Comité Français pour l'Intervention Civile de Paix and Nonviolent Peace Force, and she's a pioneer in the field. She works on new civilian-based approaches to human security, and she also trained people from different countries. We are really happy to have her here, so welcome, Professor Dubernet.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm also very honored to be part of this project, which is really close to my heart. So basically, following from my two co-speakers, I want to just say first what I want to share with you. That, below the sad theater of international confrontation, we have in the field people, communities, unarmed communities, who concretely protect other people and secure human lives, and sometimes under very difficult circumstances. And that the very fact that this exists, however fragile, however small, this fact that one can protect without weapon fundamentally challenges our dominant understanding of security. Now, let me start with a story. The story is from Konstantin Gudauskas. He was a refugee in Ukraine. As a Kazakh human rights activist, he had fled his country in 2019. He still had his Kazakh passport and lived in Bucha. As the Russians invaded the town, killing, pillaging, spreading terror, he used his Kazakh neutral status to circulate, to document Russian massacres, as well as to cross the front line, evacuating more than 200 local people in his car in the midst of war. He escaped death several times. He's nicknamed the Angel of Bucha, and is considered a hero. He is. But he's not the only one. In wars and conflict, people seek ways to protect themselves, their families, their communities, and sometimes unknown strangers. People do react. Neighbors are the first on catastrophe scenes, the ones who save life when every minute counts. Local first aid is key, and as the white helmet picture of Syria sees, you can see that they are there. And at the moment, they're very much under fire, as not only Russia, but also Israel developed double-tap attacks. But even beyond humanitarianism, people anticipate. They prepare emergency suitcases. They prepare food along the way. They send copies of their diplomas abroad. Family, circumvene and separate and recirculate. Local communities document the abuses of exploitation in their communities, especially mining, for instance. They invite in observers. There are networks of civilians who are represented there with the little drawing that's part of our teaching program. You'll have a little bit of these French drawings popping sometimes. There are people ready to step in. And yet, despite fascinating experience in Sudan, in Kosovo, in the Philippines, Colombia, this remains quite unknown to military personnel, to most diplomats, and even to academics. And in this paper, what I'd like to do with you is to explore the core of UCP, go back to what it is, but also go back to why we struggle to consider it a credible alternative, why we fail to actually put efforts into exploring its effectiveness, its efficiency, its limits, its condition of emergency. I'm not going to have much data. I'm more asking questions in that sense. But before I do that, let me just specify something, where I speak from. Because I've never been a civilian stuck in a war zone. I'm not either from the second row, these lawyers on the front line, or courageous international volunteers who accompany the most threatened. I speak from the third circle, the comfortable circle of those who study, teach, train. And I owe the inhabitants of the second and the first circle, some of them are my students, a depth of knowledge and awe, and I really wanted to share that first. You will see a couple of pictures. I've already started. These are pictures are fluted. They are just to illustrate my talk, to make it more easy to follow. Now let me ask first, what is unarmed civilian protection? The acronym UCP, which also sometimes means unarmed civilian peacekeeping, covers a wide range of non-violent, civilian-based protection initiatives, many of which entail third-party presence in threatened communities. People who observe, who accompany, sometimes do mediation, sometimes do interposition. Though there are many different types of UCP, there's a few key principles that are shared. The first one is non-violence. And I won't go back to it in detail because it's something that has already been discussed. People do not accompany armed movement or themselves practice non-violence. The second one is non-partisanship, also called impartiality. In fact, UCP draws a lot from international humanitarian law and notably from the experiences of the ICRC. The ICRC, as you know, is an organization that brings relief into war zone, but also a body in charge of civilian security in the larger sense. They do visits of prisons, they do exchange of prisoners like we see in Ukraine and Russia. They do family reunification and tracing. They do training on the respect of international norms, and that's essential. Well, UCP have translated these principles, but in the human rights field. And from the ICRC, what has also been borrowed is the confidentiality as an operating principle. That is the fact that you keep the information quite confidential, even nasty information. But that allows you to connect with all the actors in the field, including nasty actors, and allows you not to be kicked out of the field, because we'll see that the key in UCP is presence. I'll go back to that. But what makes UCP really different from other forms of organization as a practice is non-interference, which means basically the primacy granted to local actors. Local civilians are the ones who invite, and we had this invitation question, internationals. And linked to that is the fact that we focus on long-term conflict transformation. In short, what is UCP? It's continued unarmed presence to accompany conflict transformation and deter violence in polarized society. Let me go a little bit on this issue of presence. Presence is something that interests Christians in many ways. And I will use a French slide, I apologize, but it's just to have an idea. UCP is a presence. UCP teams are present. Neither military nor humanitarian. Contrary to humanitarian workers, UCP teams do not bring anything material in the zone themselves. But what they bring is awareness. The fact that the situation is observed, documented, that connections are made. UCP is relational, and relations are powerful. They're also easy to manipulate. So cautiousness will be a key when it comes to information. The second thing is that UCP teams are not armed, not even to defend themselves. This means that they are particularly vulnerable as the local people they work with. And this built special bonds, special forms of solidarity. It also means that getting the key information is crucial. Okay, the information of where not to be at the wrong time. Okay, capturing what we call also low-level signals. That means a particular ability to observe, like movements, crowd, faces, body language, and a particular listening capacity, listening rumors, listening grief, listening silences. Okay, and I love this text from Pope Francis, 2018, I think, on peace journalism, where it's written, "Where there are rumors, let me listen." That is, not ignore the rumor, not dismiss it, but not believe in the text of the rumor. Look at the context, look at the subtext. So this very quickly said, two big dimensions. Where does UCP come from? In its modern form, because I think there's been lots of ignored past form. UCP has emerged in the 1980s in Central America and has been documented since the 1990s. It started in Nicaragua, Central America, during the war against the Contras, then in Guatemala, where international volunteers, in a sense, experimented with new forms of Western civilian presence to deter attack on rural communities and connect with their own home communities. PBI, the Peace Brigades International, were created in 1981 in Canada. The Christian peacemakers teams a bit later. It expanded actually worldwide in 1990s and 2000 in Colombia, in Kosovo, in Sri Lanka, in Palestine. And there we experimented with presence in zones, but observation of checkpoint, local shuttle mediation, and etc. But also what was important in the 1990s is that a number of international organizations, I've put a couple of them here, really captured this first intuition and started to organize them in bigger missions, electoral supervision missions, monitoring missions. The OSCE has done a lot of this. And nowadays you have as much, international organization using this concept as well NGOs. You could also say that the UN has done it a long time ago, so for instance, in the north of Lebanon. But it's really overall, from the field and from NGOs that came the main, I find, intuitions and also evolutions. And that's what I wanted to talk about next. In almost 50 years of existence, UCP has evolved a lot. And one thing that has been important is to recognize that in many places, and I just put a couple of CPAS in Mexico, CACIT in Togo, and EAPPI for Palestine. There's been quite a number of organizations that are really related to single countries. When NP, Nonviolent Peace Force, was created in 2000, it brought on a new form of thinking as well, which is to move on from the idea that Western presence would protect locals, and that we would need to recruit more people from Global South to Global South and build experiences from there. And that is interesting because it has challenged older organizations like PBI, like Christian Peacemakers team, to actually start reflecting on how do we decolonize our practices. And you see, a couple of years ago, Christian peacemakers teams became community peacemakers teams because, in a sense, it wanted to signify that it was working with people of all faiths and no faith, but also because it wanted to emphasize that security is built from within the community. As Nav Maskapak, brilliant researcher on Philippines, has shown in this case in Philippine peace in the zones is very different from what we imagine from outside, and how people negotiate risk, how people circulate around it is fascinating. What I wanted to say in a sense is that we keep going on trying to think about how to somehow decolonize peace. And lately, what is interesting for me is that these ideas are coming back home in Europe. I'm giving you here a picture of an organization called All Migrants, Tous Migrants in France, where mountain guides are organizing to go and get migrants trying to go from Italy to France in the Alps, and avoiding the police, they have to go higher and higher and get trapped into very inhospitable environment. But also we could mention another initiative that comes from the UK called Where is Angela? In English. That's very interesting reflection on the safety of women in the public space and how all the actors can be involved to make sure public space is safe for everybody. There's plenty of experiences. But overall, what we could say is that, and it's important to say as well, it's my caveat, that UCP has never been a magic bullet. It's a difficult path. It's fraught with uncertainties and questions. Violent conflicts are very fluid environment where people are constantly repositioning themselves to survive, to escape, sometimes to strive. And keeping the balance between actors is always a very difficult struggle. In most cases, the institutions meant to protect civilians, states, police, the army, the justice, are profoundly ineffective, corrupt, violent themselves. Civil society actors can be wonderful, but also corrupt. And maybe corruption is not understood in the same way in Berlin and Bangkok. So there's a need to explore UCP, to understand its logic, its limit, the circumstances under which it makes sense. However, for a long time, it was very, very little studied. And all we did have until the 1990s was, oh, they are the just. They are heroes. They are exceptions. This is problematic. More recently, practitioners have themselves started to build some forms of prototype case studies and trying to learn from them, but mostly for practice itself, for strategic, etc. It's only really the first big program that you see creating here has been created, launched in 2020 in the UK, and is led by Berit de Bliesman, and is, I think, for me, the real first program trying to show diversity of what it is and also trying to explore it a bit more systematically. And it has provided amazing studies. But it remains difficult to capture UCP, not only because it's complex, there's other complex problems in the world, but because of the nature of modern science itself. Because science, has a drive to separate us into neat disciplines and categories, and to try also to theorize and to have theories that allow us to replicate and etc. And same for peace actors, because what do they look for, many of the actors in the field? They look for things like lessons from the field or transferable skills or best practices. And it's difficult to get to the complexity of it. Indeed, what I think is very interesting is that if we look from a political science perspective, one could say that UCP is impossible. It's the impossible that nevertheless exists, because we see that everywhere in the world, citizens reflect over security themselves for their families and their community. But when I speak about UCP, I'm very often told, well, this is an exception. These are heroes. And when we have a program like that shows, no, it's not an exception. There are things everywhere. Then comes the second defensive argument. And this runs like that. Well, UCP exists where it's easy, where the conflicts are not so violent, where the conflicts are not so intractable. So let me just try to tackle that. And it's risky. Let's try to look at UCP in very hard times, in Ukraine, in Congo, and in Palestine. And all of this in the context of a post-liberal context, because, as has been alluded already, we are in a difficult context. Over the last 15 years, we've had a rise of authoritarianism, a growing inequality worldwide, resources that have been switched massively from development, from environmental transition towards the military, and the idea that it's more effective to solve problems with the military. And this has accelerated, but it was already a trend with Donald Trump #2 mandate. But what is changing, I think, is that now you have people, leaders, that openly assume that there are hierarchies in humans, and that some are more or less worth protecting. Minorities, migrants, homeless people, the handicapped, the aged. And their suffering and death is progressively invisibilized as we cut the funding for research and etc. So all the projects that are liberal in heart, and UCP is part of that, have been created in the 1980s, 1990s, are really facing strong headwind. They've accepted a commonly liberal peace and human rights framework. Still, I will try to briefly show you that things are still happening. Let's start with Ukraine. When the government of Russia invaded Crimea in 2014 and launched a hybrid war in the Donbass, Europeans were shocked. But they privileged negotiation, Minsk I and Minsk II. And while at the same time they started to sanction Russia very lightly. The US chose in parallel to rearm Ukraine. Between 2014 and 2022, the Organization of the Security in Europe was present on the front line. working. It had a special mission, and it was working 24/7. It had about 750 observers and about 1,300 personnel in ground. What they were doing, they were monitoring the ceasefire, documenting violations, trying to help people cross the front line, trying to sort out, administrative situations that were completely crazy. They were negotiating with the different armed groups. Of course, they faced quite a number of limits imposed by Moscow. It had only limited ground access to certain sensitive areas, no access to Crimea, which Russia had declared its own. And they also had problems in acceding territories around Donetsk, for instance. When they were evacuated in March 2022, after the full-scale invasion, the operation was declared a failure by everybody. And I think it's something we should revisit. Because even if clearly the OSCE didn't manage to get the war from restarting, because it was a consensus-based organization and things were pretty blocked, it actually did a lot of things that were very useful locally. The two big actors wanted to go back to war in many ways. But what is interesting is that, first, well, one has to say that the OSCE didn't have the means to do its mandates. That's the case in many situations. But I would also suggest that the monitoring mission itself fulfilled its mission, and it even fulfilled it probably too well, because it brought up quite a number of data, quite a number of observations that were disturbing to the main political actors. They were also very useful in helping civilians with the mining system. They were evacuating. And when it came to dialogue, which did work at the national level, there was a lot of dialogue that worked at the local level, at the level of de-escalation in the Donbass in particular. They were very aware of the rebuilding of the forces in Russia. They asked to be pre-positioned in other places. They were not allowed to. But in a sense, that was part of what was really important to document what is actually happening on the floor in the place. After 2022, it's the Ukrainians themselves who had already started, but carried on doing that crucial documentation that allowed us to search the local truth and to allowed people to, counter the narrative of Russia. And that's absolutely, looking for the truth is absolutely crucial. And then, of course, these people were supported by circles of solidarity, Ukrainian circles of solidarity, international circles of solidarity, most of the people coming in and out, but some kind of state, and I'm thinking Nonviolent Peace Force is still in the field at the moment, working, they mostly accompanying local humanitarians, delivering food and etc. But they're also documenting the changing nature of threat for civilians. And I love the title of one of their last reports, expanding the duty to care. I think it's really interesting the way they look at drone issues and etc. So I think this is something that I want to learn from it. It's difficult. It doesn't stop the great, problems, but it shows that things are carrying on, and these things are important. The second example I wanted to go to is IJWI, and this one I borrow from Séverine Autesserre, who is a researcher. And she brought up this idea. I also met people myself, people from IJWI that told me that's really true what she wrote about. The island of IJWI is situated in the middle of Lake Kivu, between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda. And it's a very interesting case of peace built from the ground up. It's home to about 300,000 inhabitants, and it went through all these wars, very close to the epicenter, the Kivu, North Kivu, South Kivu. And what is very special about IJWI that it remained at peace, whereas, insularity didn't protect other islands who were completely destroyed. Whether, you don't have an homogeneous population, you have a minority, which is actually quite discriminated against, where you have political infighting between two Mwamis, that is our traditional elders. You also have no state, no state services, and extreme poverty. And there's even apparently some exploitable resources, which is often a problem. But what the people say, and what maintains peace in IJWI, is endogenous mechanisms that are passed on from generation to generation. And the idea of turning to local mediation, elders, priests, community association and WAMIs, rather than to violence or to the police. And there's dozens of associations working on that. There are blood pacts between families, there are non-aggression pledges, there's a whole system. And very interestingly enough, because they also received refugees, every citizen is involved in surveying the kind of local ceasefire and teaching the norms to the newcomers. And I think that's really also very important to bear in mind, that there is this ongoing work, that peace is actually work, it just doesn't happen like that. Let me turn to my third example, possibly the most difficult, the most tricky one at the moment. As you know, since the arrival of an extreme right government in autumn '92, settlers' expansion of violence has drastically increased in the occupied territory. I'm not even speaking about Gaza. Fueled by police protection and near total impunity, the settlers attacked farms, occupied land, confiscated or destroyed wealth. And this is what has been called the routinization of terror. It's actually quite aligned with the document's government agenda of the occupied territory, which is mass ethnic cleansing. If you haven't seen it, I would encourage you to see the film No Other Land that really exemplifies that. But I would also encourage you to read one of the projects coming out of Creating Safer Space, a research project which is called Unarmed Civilian Protection in Palestine. And that book is quite amazing because it helps us to rethink the struggle that is and the phases of the struggle that are now in long-term waves, and showing that, for instance, in the first intifadas, you had mostly outsiders that would be journalists that would come and go. And then you had some new fights against the wall, for instance, and you had some new forms of civilian resistance organization. And this is where there started to be international organization coming and staying with the people and staying to document. Of course, the Israeli government, limited things to 3 months, so you had to organize rotations and etc. The last point, it's a struggle for dignity. Now, the book is focused on the South Hebron Hills, Masaferiyata, and what is found very interesting is that it emphasized the fact that Palestinian, Israeli, and internationals are basically reinforcing and supporting each other. And again, that international attention is absolutely crucial, but presence is very important humanly as well. There's one chapter that I love that goes back to the concept of sumud that has been used by youth group in many different places. And sumud means steadfastness. It means holding firm. And this is, I find, fascinating to see how people, in a sense, anchor themselves in some form of concept, in some form of faith, in some form of intellectual grounding and social networks in front of complete abandonment and no financial resources. So from there, I want to question that from a political science point of view. Because I think what is happening is that an armed civilian perspective broadens our understanding of those involved in security. It offers non-aggressive and possibly effective alternative for protection, particularly in some contexts, more than in others. But it, of course, has limits. But above all, I think it challenges the way we think about politics today. And first, this point. Security is not only a matter for states. In modern political science, states are regarded as the security provider. And this conception has its roots in the emergence of European states and a state system in the wake of the wars of religions. And from, Boden, Hobbes, Weber, Morgan to Machiavelli, Locke, you can put a lot of people. But at the heart of this, historical and intellectual construct lies the assumption that sovereigns ensure the security of citizens top down. And despite the many instances of governance being a source of insecurity themselves for the citizen, states firmly defend their exclusive prerogative over security, which lies at the heart of their legitimacy, and you can understand that. My problem is that this focus tends to prevent consideration of the alternative forms of security that I'm talking about. And how civilians actually do address real key security and life-saving security when you accompany civilians through checkpoints to local hospitals, to prisons visits, when you, observe how communities vote against the mining in their regions, when you're conducting night patrols in refugee camps. This all demonstrates very concretely what security is. And I wanted to show you this picture that was taken in Aleppo during the worst of the war in 2015, where people, thought about putting some old buses there to allow circulation, because circulation is an issue in conflict situations. When people can't circulate, it prevents people from being able to escape, to emancipate, to exchange ideas, to meet the other one. So that's really important. And what I think is really interesting, and this is what I'm working on, I won't have much time to explain, but I think what we are bringing in here is the idea that we have some form of circles of not only solidarity but protection. Friends, social network, unions, political groups, towns, regions, all the levels, different functions. And what we're thinking about here is subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is a key concept in the Catholic social doctrine since Rerum Novarum. But I think there's a real issue. And where it's particularly interesting is that when we think about security in subsidiary system, what we are seeing here is that we are connecting protection with agency. That is, we are reversing what is actually been told to us for the last 25 years, is that we've been playing security against freedom. If you want security, you have to give up freedom. But when we think of security with subsidiarity and looking at this type of processes, then we reconnect the two, which I think is absolutely crucial for us now. So, of course, states will, they find it very troubling that security is not their business. So they have often good reason for it. They are afraid that the trust and obedience of self-organized civilians will evaporate. And so what they do is that they tend to intimidate their own citizens with their own exercise of power, but also that, they highlight the nightmare of places where there's no state. Like the horrors of gang war in Haiti, the unease caused by gated communities, or the risk of American-style shootings, and etc. Security, it says, can't be left in the hands of citizens. It's far too dangerous. So states are not perfect, but at least they bring a lot of things. So I think that's interesting. There's some truth in it, of course, but it's also problematic because first, it's very often government themselves that delegate security to sometimes private actors, for the better, for the worse. Second, that they fail to secure citizens because they also fail to secure health services, basic food access, schools, and etc. They fail to care, in a sense. So, in a sense, the problem of the limits pointed out is that it fails to take into account a second point that I want to make, is that security is not only a matter of threats, of handling political and military threats. UCP is based on an approach to security, including fundamental rights, that focuses above all on relationship and conceives security in terms of building connections, rather than focusing on identifying threats and handling them. In UCP, threats are not, in a sense, ignored, but first they are approached critically with critical security studies, for instance, so you ask yourself, is this person really an enemy? Who is telling me that this person is really an enemy? And second, security issues are reconceptualized not as threat, but as risks. And when you look at risk, and there's a whole set of risky questions, you start to engage in terms of vulnerabilities, in terms of impact, and in terms of capacities. How can I create more capacity if I face that or that or that risks? And again, here comes again agency. And I think that's really, really important. And it's wonderful because this framework to approach security helps us also to connect with other big concepts, like the human security frameworks of the UNDP, like restorative justice, like other concepts that we could work together. I've put a picture of the women peacekeeping teams in Sudan from NP. This is really, really amazing what has been made, how women actually retook agency and tried to reflect on how to face their own risk and how to support each other and how to make sure that the girl that has been raped is not going to leave schools and etc. So there's a whole work that we can do on this one. Now the question remains, there are limits, of course, but there's also issue of comparison. Okay, I take it. UCP requires a minimum level of cooperation of host states, as well as a high degree of professionalism, of legal analysis, of confidentiality, and etc. The existence of a normative legal framework seems quite important, it's difficult without. And so UCP probably hasn't got a place in fully totalitarian regimes, nor in situation of large-scale assumed genocide. That makes it very difficult. It has little or no leverage in case of total impunity, and is not well suited as well, I think, to challenge violent cultural practice, such as, for instance, forced marriage, if this practice is largely accepted in the society. You have to have a discrepancy between a practice and what is accepted in a society, what is legitimate in a society. And there you can enter and start, in a sense, to think. But overall, it has proved very effective in engaging with armed actors and political actors that seek to maintain, assert, or regain a degree of legitimacy. And this is a key factor to work. And beyond effectiveness lies the question of efficiency. ICP operates for only a fraction of the cost of military operation and cause no physical destruction. They do, however, entail risk, particularly for local activists who may feel encouraged and even emboldened when they are accompanied. And you can have all sorts of abuse and manipulation, and we've had that. But the thing is interesting as well. We always speak of success, but what about failure? What about the cost of failure? If you think about it, military operation, the cost of intervention, but the cost of failure is much bigger than unarmed civilian peacekeeping. And I think we should consider that as well, because it's part of the risk of the impact. Very difficult, often, I love this picture as well. No, I'll take this one, is the fact that very often these operations cannot be isolated and studied on their own. They are often in parallel with military interventions. And so when we study them, it's very difficult to isolate the famous parameters that we are all looking for. And it's part of the tricky thing about studying it. But nevertheless, the differential between this intriguing and interesting result and this long-term result and the money that we blast in military and maybe sometimes in classical humanitarianism can be questioned. Here the picture that I show you is a picture of what was termed a security meeting. A security meeting in Iraq, in a refugee camp. And I show the picture to my students because, these women know what security is, what security problems are. They put their children in the middle and they do a meeting around it. And they talk about real security issues for them. When we think about a security meeting in NATO, we see a completely different pictures. So my point is that, however modest they may be, such form of coherence in conflict zones stands in stark contrast with military-led protection. And, the latter is often very hollow. We talk about security architectures, but very often we have kind of scaffolding built on empty promises, be it in Libya, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. They lack connection to people's experience. And I think what UCP brings us is a sense of the fabric of security. Looking at the depth of security, the layers of security, and this is what we are missing. And last point that I find is important. We need to go beyond these two big issues of states and threat, but think in terms of robustness and fruitfulness. UCP is radical. It questions politics and political science. I think political science is very defensive. It offers an enlarged understanding to protection of its multiple actors, its structures. It invites us to reread history anew as well. Paradoxically, I would contend that it's far more realist than military approaches because it is anchored in local reality and takes into account complexity. If it's difficult to evaluate with the new public management terms, effectiveness, efficiency, if it's difficult, it's because it doesn't quite fit also in it, because maybe it belongs to somewhere else. It belongs to social robustness. And maybe, people who design UCP ideas are a sign that people hold on to a community of destiny. They see each other still as having a common Palestinian, Ukrainian, Congolese give us lessons about how to walk through violence, how to take responsibility. And I've discovered recently the work of this French biologist who pointed out that in the world, in nature, survival in a fragmented, turbulent environment is not a matter of control, is not a matter of optimization and of performance. It's not about speed and effectiveness and efficiency. It's about maintaining stability in the short term and viability in the long term. And it has to do with slowing down. It has to do with heterogeneous processes, with redundancy. And maybe this slow, difficult process are about that. It echoes another book that has been translated into English from 2 other biologists as well, the title of which I absolutely love, Mutual Head, The Other Law of the Jungle, and encourages to think what is the law of the jungle. And what they show actually is that when it gets hot, competition increases, but cooperation increases as well. And that's something that we are witnessing. UCP is being opened as well to other things. I'm sure the people who have been here working in religious communities know what I speak when I speak about a presence that brings awareness, a presence that is very humble, a presence that is just there and is there for things to happen and is ready to wait that things happen, is ready to care until things move on. Bring very little to the conflict zone, but open up the space. And here we're talking not about effectivity, not about efficiency, we're talking about fruitfulness. That is the readiness to let something new happen, and has happened, like this women peacekeeping teams in Sudan. Last, it's a bet on humanity, and I think this is a deep challenge to another big assumptions in political science. UCP, by being unarmed, are betting on core humanity, are betting on dignity, are betting on mimetism in front of them. They challenges that the human in front of them will, stop. They are disarmed, and maybe it will disarm the other one, at least disarm the other person long enough for questions to emerge, for something to happen. And I think that's really important. We've got this idea in our head, so busy in our idea, reinforced with 2 world wars in the 20th century, that we are very nasty beings fundamentally, and in difficult times the nasty in us will re-emerge. But it's not. It's a very narrow part of our history. It's a very biased part of our history. And I would also invite you to look at Rutger Bregman, A Positive History of Humanity, where he goes back to all this episode where we think we've been very nasty, and he shows that it's not necessarily the case. So, let me conclude. I think it's high time. In summary, what we've learned is, from the study of UCP, is that protection is about connections, multiple connections, vertical, horizontal, diagonal, in layers, and connections where we have to wave with the uncomfortable, with what frightens us. That protection is less about separating oneself from threats, and less even about eradicating dangerous people, but about how to navigate danger zone, how to prepare for risk, how to connect with whom we are afraid of. And sometimes how to constrain, how to wave around nasty actors, norms, and constraints of different kinds. If it is almost unthinkable in political science, and political science is quite difficult, it's also because it challenges deeply held assumptions that hold the discipline together. The myth that states protect citizens who in return owe obedience to it, but also that humans are fundamentally selfish and non-courageous, which is narrow. And to finish, I want to go back to Konstantin. Konstantin was a refugee in Ukraine. The government of Ukraine had given Konstantin the refugee status, that is, international protection, according to the 1951 convention, recognizing that Konstantin was without state protection. But in 2022, it is Konstantin that protected the Ukrainians. And this echoes multiple stories that I've lived of refugees and migrants, sometimes more aware, sometimes more engaged than citizens for the common good. In 2015 in Paris, it's a migrant working in a supermarket that hid the shoppers against the terrorists. During COVID, foreigners were overrepresented in this contingent of essential workers, emptying our bins, cleaning public transport and hospitals, at the supermarket till. We can still choose to discount these stories as exceptions, thereby maintaining the mainstream political paradigm about danger and protection. Or we can see them as a signs of times, or these people as messengers of hope who can teach us about community destroyed and rebuilt, about presence, about empowerment. And this is what I wanted to share. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dubernet. And I don't know if any of you have questions before we also open a broader conversation with the three of our speakers. Okay. Yeah, Ken.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. So I was fortunate to be at the launch of NP, Nonviolent Peace Force, in 2002 in India, where 154 people from 50 nations around the world came together around this concept. And it was very powerful, and it's powerful to see what it's created in the last quarter century. And I do know that there's a group like Operation Dove, which has also been in Ukraine and comes out of Catholic, some Catholic origins. But I do wonder, especially in light of all the what might be called spiritual as well as political aspects that you've identified here in terms of presence and connection is our protection and so forth. Do you imagine, especially since you are at the Institut Catholique, that there could either be a Catholic nonviolent peace force, a Catholic UCP, explicit nonviolent army, as Gandhi called it, Shanti Sena, or at least the church training people to join existing organizations like NP or some of these other ones that you mentioned. What are you seeing, perhaps, as the possibility of, as the Catholic Church further embraces nonviolence, that it at part of its, I wouldn't even call it necessarily missionary work, but its presence in the world, being explicitly taking up UCP?
Thank you very much. I've been training people for about a bit more than 15 years now on these issues. In my trainings, I always have priests. I think they are on the front line. And I think many religious communities are doing exactly that type of presence, that type of endurance, that type of patience, that type of care. They also have networks, they have places of safety that's actually recognized by international humanitarian law. And they are already doing that work. I think there's an issue, and it echoes what we've discussed earlier. There's an issue of awareness. There's an issue of conceptualization and going and looking for the intellectual resources. But I've seen so many people already doing that. I've seen priests in the north of Cameroon, taking their moped and going and say the mass in the Boko Haram areas and coming back and training people and opening doors, doing all sorts of things that are very much the expression of locally how it can happen. So I think it's already happening. What we need is to, and even before we feed people with more material and more resources and etc., we listen to them, to what they really want, to what they really do, and how they conceptualize things, because that's one of our problems. Often we come with our nicely built solution, or the solution's built in another continent, and we think it's the right one to go. So there's an issue to open space and to let people talk about security. What is security? when you do that in refugee camp, you sometimes have amazing things happening. I remember the story from Thailand of, there was a refugee camp, a closed refugee camp of Burmese people, and there was a lot of violence against women and etc. And so at one point the humanitarians, put the women together and say, what can we do with your men being so violent, etc. And the women said one simple thing: let the men go out of the camp. Let them go and find work, and we'll be fine, okay? And this is something nobody had thought of. So this is really important to start from the ground, and also the ground of the religious communities, how they see security. They work on peace, and peace is there. There's something else that I want to add to that question. I think behind you, I don't know if it's what you meant, but my reading of nonviolence, and we have had a lot on nonviolence, is that nonviolence has had moments as well with particular theories. So I sometimes, to simplify things, I'll say, we've had three big movements. Well, we've had two big movements of nonviolence, and I think the third one coming. The first one is, we'll say, classical nonviolence, King, Gandhi. It's a mix of a spiritual position, so strongly intellectual spiritual position, and strategic cleverness and strategic positioning. That has carried us, and still is there to some extent. But then came a second movement, the Gene Sharp movement, if you want, where I say, okay, we don't need all the spiritual thing, that's actually more a handicap, but we can focus on the strategic and explore that and detail that and etc. And that has also had its momentum, very, very importantly. The two coexist, of course, but there's been this momentum on strategizing. My bet is that, a lot of people have read Chenoweth and Stefan, but I think the people who've read it most are the military leaders and the dictators. And they've helped violence quite a lot. And they deconstructed also things over the last 10 years. And I think we need a nonviolence 3.0 that revisits, because we don't have material resources anymore, that revisits the intellectual, the spiritual, the invisible and immaterial resources. And that's valid, of course, for Catholics, but I think it's valid for everybody, any form of spirituality, any form of intellectual humanism, or etc. We need to get new resources and build from, because times are difficult, build from this anchoring in spirituality. I'm not sure I understood your question or responded to your question best, but it's my way.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Sister Cecile.
I'd like to maybe even continue this conversation, but how do you train the individual persons who are in this unarmed peace course to have their own personal safety?
Their own personal safety?
Yes. How do they, that they themselves are grounded in personal safety as they go in to some very difficult situations?
Well, it's a crucial question. It's a crucial question because first you have to pay attention to personal safety, but also because there is one principle in UCP. If you're not safe, you're not going to make your neighbor safe. Okay? So you need to think of it very, very carefully. There's a couple of principles that I give my students. The first thing is that it's very important. If an organization wants to send you in a war zone without training, without protocol, with just thinking, with goodwill, you go, forget it. It's like in strategic resistance, please don't go. There are such organizations as well. It's like in nonviolence, like you were mentioning, you need to train, you need to strategize, you need to look at the threats, you need to deconstruct them, you need to take the time with it. And not only before you go, when you're there all the time. That is, the people in UCP spend their life doing analysis constantly and checking. And when they do an accompaniment, you warn all the actors. You have it's connections that hold you. Sometimes you're not allowed, say Colombia, you're not allowed to have direct interaction with the rebels. Okay, so you don't have. Otherwise, you'll be kicked out of the country. So for many years, you don't have. But you're known in the community. Everybody knows you. And it's important everybody knows you and understands what you're doing, because you could be easily taken for a spy as well, and it's very dangerous. But you will get the information. Indirect way, no way. This is a safe passage. This is not a safe passage. There you should be better. There you should pay attention. You're connected with all the actors. And you have to do this checking work all the time. And sometimes there are things you have to say no to. There are things you can't do. There are protocols of security that have to be very strict and respected. And it's actually real training, and I think all the organizations are taking that seriously. There has been a couple of incidents or hostage taking. I think there's 1 or 2 deaths. There's a very well-known death in Palestine in 2004-06 of a young American. It's really part of the training. It's the core of the training. The core of the training is safety, but safety not understood as I'm gonna barricade myself, or I'm gonna go out with the weapons. Because when you go out with weapons to bring safety, you don't connect with people. So this is the heart of the work. So I say lots of training, lots of analysis, permanent analysis, and cautiousness as well. And maybe your job, sometimes you say, no, we don't go. Maybe our job is to say, okay, let's try to find other ways. Let's try to do, for instance, there's been some accompaniment from afar, so that the local people absolutely want to do something. You think it's not safe, you're not going to go. You warn them, they want to do it. Then you can try to organize a protocol to follow them, so that with regular calls, with all sorts of systems, to actually try to protect them. Yeah, Mary.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you so much. It was such an important sharing of a perspective on nonviolence and on security. My question is about, you touched on it a little bit. We were involved as Pax Christi somewhat in the establishment of UCP in Palestine, and have sort of followed the possibilities of UCP in Palestine over the last few years. I live in a community with a former member of the EAPPI who is now involved in, because my question is, what do you do, and this might be to all of you, when those in power, those who are creating the violence and the dangerous situations, have the power to prevent the entry of accompaniers into my colleague is now doing accompaniment by phone and internet on a regular basis with particular families and communities in Palestine. But I was listening to what you all presented this morning. I was looking for how do we think about the intersection of the different stages, the different expressions of nonviolent action. So, how do we come to a place where we begin to recognize that there's a need for mass mobilization, or there's a need for much, deeper accompaniment, or there's a need for international solidarity. And I think that, with just any thoughts you have about that, and most particularly in a place right now, it is almost impossible for those external unarmed accompaniers to enter Palestine and to enter the West Bank. And I know people locally are doing a lot, but a little bit, if you could say a little bit more about how do we respond, what are the responses to the powers that be, who are learning well how to interrupt the nonviolent strategies and approaches that are often very effective.
Well, I think for a while, EAPPI has been, for instance, working on tourist visas to go around this, making sure that, trying to not be arrested at Tel Aviv airport, entering via Jordan has been also a technique. That's basically what I do is try to circumvent the blockages. One can do that, but one should also document, and that Israel is refusing visas And there's really, it's very important. Because, you know, people who are engaged in this struggle, I said it's a struggle for dignity, they know they're probably not going to see, you know, an end to the struggle. They probably, it's decade long. But they also are writing a story. They also are writing memory. They also are writing dignity into the process. And for that, documentation is essential. And so if we can support that and document and document and document, it prevents the powers that be to have their own narrative, which is very powerful and it's blasted all around the media, to actually dominate. Because the problem are not only the facts, it's the narratives that we put on the facts. It's how we tell a story in that sense. So I think circumvent, document, and persist. Persist. Keep going, because at one point, maybe some more opening will happen. And talking about connecting, for a system to transform itself, I would say endogenous processes are key. Second-row supporters are important from within and from outside. UCPs are more the ones who are from within and sometimes quite discreet, but they do a very important work. And then you need, of course, sometimes they can't pass on information publicly, but they might share information with other networks, the one that put the pressure from outside. That means Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and etc. But for UCP, information is first often circulated within diplomatic circles, very discreetly. I forgot to say that, but it's not, information is not necessarily blasted out, but it goes via all the networks related to diplomacy, because there are ways to put pressure from within as well. It's not much, but yes, please.
Just to add onto your question about maybe when or how would you generate solidarity or pressure. One example that comes to mind for me, partly because you're probably familiar with Jose Andres. Okay, so this is a very famous chef, a Spanish chef who works in DC, and he started the charity World Central Kitchen, and they feed people in disaster contexts, including Palestine. And they went in and they lost some volunteer members to an Israeli attack. And one of the things that, for me, kind of resonates in thinking about your question is their whole goal is to feed people. Like, literally, that's the goal, right? Is people need to eat, right? It's so basic. It's so apolitical, if we can keep it apolitical, right? And so in a place where they are, where other actors are limited, I think this idea of having an organization or a set of volunteers that are working on something so basic as eating maybe offers an opportunity. And then also, as communities outside or outsiders see this, right? They see these people that are risking their lives to go in and feed people, and they're being attacked, or or there's a death. It's very resonant with, I think, certainly in the United States, with people there to hear that information and to think about, the pressure then, right, getting into the cycle of pressure as well. Yeah. Also, his food is delicious. So.
Yeah, I can add some thoughts on this as well. So we were discussing earlier the connections between spirituality and nonviolence, and something I, did not bring up in our earlier conversation, but I'm thinking about in this context is, so I think the power of nonviolence, I think, can be summarized in a spiritual principle from the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, which is the idea of interbeing, which many of you may be already familiar with. This idea that none of us exist as individuals. I exist because we exist. I am because we are. And that the power of nonviolence is the power, exactly as you brought up, Cecile, before, of connection. And that we are all deeply connected to one another in complex ways that we don't always understand or notice. And so I think the power of strategize, I think effective strategy for nonviolence at its core is about recognizing the ways in which we depend on one another, and the ways in which the oppressor and the oppressed are not separate from one another. They are deeply interconnected with one another. I think as well about Johann Galtung, one of these earlier foundational figures in the study of peace, and his idea, he called it the great chain of nonviolence, that even if, and Kathleen brought up earlier the boomerang effect, this idea that even if kind of in the moment, say the oppressor and the oppressed, the oppressed seem to have no sort of direct path for challenging the oppressor, there are roundabout paths. There are connections, there are indirect connections that lead to those sort of levers of power and dependency. And so I think the specific example that you brought up of it may not be possible to do UCP in the same way that it's been done in the past in Palestine, because the government of Israel is preventing that from happening. And so I think the general principle would be to think about other dimensions of dependence and connection upon which new strategies can draw. So whether that is UCP over the phone, as was mentioned before, whether that is I think about the BDS movement, thinking about these other sort of complex ways in which we are all kind of connected to one another, and have points through which kind of pressure can be made, but also through which outreach can be made as well. And then sort of there's a kind of classic organizer tool of a power map, where you think about not just who's on top and who's on the bottom, but how are we all connected to one another? And if we, our particular sort of group of organizers don't have a connection to a decision maker, we might have a connection to their friend, or we might have a connection to their friend's partner, and that way, and through those other avenues, we can kind of exert influence. So I think the principle of interbeing is something that I always come back to as kind of a core idea at the center of how we think about both the spirituality of nonviolence and also the strategy of nonviolence as well.
Well, now that the three speakers are in dialogue, I want to bring you, well, this is, I don't know if this is a question or a challenge in itself. So we are here today in Rome, and in the following days, Pope Leo will be meeting with the cardinals. Pope Leo has been making a call since the very beginning of his pontificate, to follow Jesus' nonviolent response, and he has bring to the world this concept of unarmed and disarming peace that for many of us is the exact definition of what we mean by nonviolence. So I want you to make this difficult imagination, imagine that you will have the opportunity, that maybe Pope Leo is watching the recording of this seminar, and you have the opportunity to give some advice on what the Catholic Church could do, to promote this nonviolent response. What at the institutional level, what the Catholic Church could do. Sorry for making this difficult challenge at the end.
Sure, I'll start. Briefly, since I did basically put this in the presentation, so I'll give you guys more time to think. And this actually, I think Ken also gave me the answer in his questions earlier. The church is a unique actor, right? I study political authority and a lot of non-state actors and also states and devolution. The church is outside of that and beyond that and integrated with these authority structures all around the world. And it has, I think, a unique position not only because of its sort of mandate and role, but also just its reach and the ways in which it reaches communities. And so I think, my statement would be in sort of thinking about how you can promote solidarity, both, at the top level, right, and the kind of ways that we see that I think he is doing, but also maybe at the other levels, at the different ways that members of the community and of the clergy and of the sort of hierarchy can look for access points to apply pressure, right, and to make known their solidarity with communities that they want to support. And that's likely to vary from place to place. So we just had a short conversation at the break on the Catholic Church in France, which is different than the Catholic Church in the United States. And so, so attention to that, I think, would be really useful.
First, I'd like to thank Pope Leo because he amazed me. In 1 year, 1 year ago, I didn't know what to think. And the way he stood up, so few leaders actually stand up, not only to Trump, but to the very idea that humans can be classified into the winners, the losers, and etc. The way Catholic theology, but all Christians' ideas are now completely soiled by some form of terrible ideology. So standing up to that firmly, but with a lot of cleverness and delicacy, and avoiding the front confrontation. I'm amazed. I'm really grateful. I would say, to go back to your question, it's important that Catholic institutions everywhere realize what they are already doing and what they are already doing well, and how much what they do secures people in all sorts of different ways. Sometimes it doesn't work, but still. And to finish, it's important that is documented, because it's also a way to show that before you get to war, there are many options. And as you know, last resort is one of the reasons that has been used to go to war. So it's completely false reason, because most of the time, look at the last war in Iran. But it's an argument that is part of just war theory. And when we enlarge the scope and look at how people solve conflict and what the thing is done in the Catholic Church and elsewhere beyond, we can, really go back to this argument of last resort and show that there are alternatives that work, and destroy this last resort argument that my government in France is using massively at the moment. There is no time, there is no choice. We have to go for heavy militarization and confrontation with Russia. This, what is being done, is already great. Now, let it be known.
It's funny. This question reminds me of the dean of my college has a favorite question that she likes to ask new job candidates, which is, if you had unlimited resources to do research, what would you do? And so being able to, tell the Holy Father, what would you do with the Catholic Church, which, as we've discussed here, is 1.4 billion people, and a vast and complex institutional architecture, feels kind of similar to that. I think if I had to summarize it down, I would go back to a number of things that have come up in our discussion today, which is this, and one principle in particular, which is the centrality of local organizations and communities in which people are deeply embedded. And there's kind of abundant research on this in a number of contexts as well, that societies are better able to mobilize for kind of nonviolent resistance in the streets. They're better able to sustain civic institutions and protect democracy, and they're better able to protect each other in situations of violence and armed conflict when they are deeply rooted in community institutions. And I think religious institutions in general, and the Catholic Church in particular, are, I think, one of the most central of those institutions. And so I think incorporating in that vast network of, local structures in which individuals are deeply rooted, the kinds of awareness of the examples of things like UCP, things like nonviolent resistance, and training in specific methods of engaging in those, I think is absolutely crucial and could play a huge role in sort of advancing nonviolence around the world. If every person in their local parish community learned about the power, and not even just of nonviolence broadly speaking, but of the power of local churches in building nonviolence, and if kind of training and connection in that was a part of the religious life of 1.4 billion Catholics, that would change the world. The world would never be the same. And so I think that would be, and that would look many different ways depending on the specifics of the community, the specifics of the context. But I think if I could tell the Holy Father anything, that is what I would tell him.
Well, thank you so much to the three of them. I think maybe there is not a best way to end this seminar this morning. And I just want to, well, first of all, to thank to all of you who have been together with us this morning, to our three speakers that they made a long journey, and we are really grateful that they have been here with us and sharing all that. I want to let you know that our recently born in 2024 Catholic Institute for Nonviolence has already at this moment over 40 associates among the three of that are here are three of greatest scholars in the world working on nonviolence, and they are giving their expertise, their knowledge, and their time to this mission of the institute, and we hope to go on contributing to move gospel nonviolence into our church. So thanks a lot to the three of you. Thanks a lot to all the people here, and thanks to the people who will see us on the recording. Thank you.